Hello and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we are educators who have been in education for over 20 years. On this podcast, we are coming together to work out and make sense of the research and expert perspectives around reading instruction. Recently, there have been many experts weighing in with their opinion on what works when it comes to reading instruction and what doesn't work. But this isn't new. As you heard in our first episode, the theories about reading pedagogy have truly had a pendulum swing coming and going since the 1950s, right? This works now, and it just keeps coming back. But Anna and I really know that, the reading instruction is so complex and there are so many components of it. But we also know reading is only one component of literacy. And we really want to make sure that every student graduates as a literate individual. And so we want to really examine all of the complexities around teaching, reading, writing, and this whole idea of making sure that our students exit our educational system as literate individuals. We're also talking about the complexity specifically around our multilingual students. Right? Our students that come in with all of the gifts of their home language, and we want to make sure that they are graduating with that literate in English and other languages. So how can we best do that? So in our podcast, we're talking to a lot of experts, and we have one here today.
We are so incredibly honored and a little excited to have Jim Cummins here with us today. If you are a teacher listening to this podcast, Jim Cummins' work has influenced many, many, many components of what we do every single day. His work has guided us for decades when it comes to pedagogy around language instruction, around literacy. But let me just read to you his incredible bio because I know that I can't just summarize it on my own. So today we have with us Jim Cummins. Jim Cummins is a Professor Emeritus at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on literacy development in educational context, characterized by linguistic and socioeconomic diversity. In his numerous articles and books, he has explored the nature of language proficiency and its relationship to literacy development, with a particular emphasis on the intersections of societal power relations, teacher-student equity negotiation, and literacy attainment. His most recent book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, a critical analysis of theoretical concepts, was published in the fall of 2021. He is the recipient of the International Reading Association's 1979 Albert J. Harris Award and has received honorary doctorates from 5 universities in North America and Europe in recognition of his contributions to the issues of educational equity and multilingual education. With such an incredible resume and career in education, it's just such an honor to have you on the show. And like I said, your work, I remember in my second language acquisition class really being a huge influence on who I wanted to be as a teacher and thinking about my career as an educator. So thank you so much for your dedication and for your work and influence in education. We are so happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Victoria, for that really lovely introduction and the opportunity to be part of your podcast.
So we're going to jump right into it. We know that you probably have quite a few other things to do on your list of things today, but your work has influenced literacy and language instruction, like I said, for many decades. But there is new research. There are new opinions. There's a lot of conversation about what does effective literacy instruction look like. So we are really looking forward to hearing your expertise. What does effective literacy look like and sound like?
Well, at one level, the issues are far more simple and less complicated than they've been made to appear. Victoria mentioned that the so-called reading wars go back at least to the 1950s, and the pendulum has swung wildly back and forth since that time. And a landmark event, I guess, in terms of reading debates in the United States, but also internationally, was the National Reading Panel report, which was published in 2020. And this report was interpreted as basically saying phonics are the key to reading instruction. They identified 5 components of effective reading instruction and highlighted the role that phonics in particular played. That report has been criticized by quite a number of people, including me, on multiple grounds. One is the fact that the report has been misinterpreted for political reasons by the members of the Reading First panels who essentially interpreted what the National Reading Panel was saying as that phonics is the key, the panacea. It's all we need to focus on. The reason kids are not learning to read is that they haven't been taught phonics and phonemic awareness effectively. In actual fact, the National Reading Panel endorsed a balanced approach to reading instruction. They did not demonize balanced approaches in the way that subsequent researchers and policymakers and pundits have. A balanced approach is explicitly endorsed. They say that phonics is important, but it shouldn't be the dominant component in reading instruction. And there are many other things that need to be addressed. So the first thing to highlight is the fact that there's been a huge amount of disinformation in this debate over the past 20 years and also before that. And I'm not suggesting that this disinformation is necessarily malicious, but it doesn't accurately report what the National Reading Panel found and reported, and it doesn't accurately reflect the research evidence. When you look at the research evidence, I think it's useful to step back a little bit and go back to what we all know. We all know that there are big class differences in terms of success in reading. Kids who are living in poverty tend to have much more difficulty acquiring strong reading skills and other content skills in comparison to kids who are in more fortunate, more affluent backgrounds. Middle-class kids, for the most part, pick up phonics skills in a relatively fast and straightforward way, and there's far less reading failure among kids from affluent backgrounds as compared to children from less affluent backgrounds. So let's ask, why is that? Well, a major reason comes down to the fact that kids from middle-class backgrounds have about a 4-year advantage in terms of literacy socialization in their homes, in the preschool programs that they go to, in the kinds of instruction that they get in the early stages of school, compared to students from less affluent backgrounds. Families that are wondering where they're going to get money to put the next meal on the table generally don't have money lying around to go out and buy books. They're not getting their kids fancy iPads or tablets for birthday presents. They don't have the means to take kids to various kinds of expensive cultural pastimes. And so you've got a situation where there's far more print access among kids from middle-class backgrounds compared to children from less affluent backgrounds. Now, there may be a lot of really culturally enriching things going on in the families of low socioeconomic background students, but typically this knowledge is not picked up by schools. So when we look at one of the major reasons why there is excessive school difficulties in terms of learning to read, it's because we have a big difference in literacy socialization. And what happens when kids from low-income backgrounds get to school? Well, I think that the work of Nell Duke is really key here, and other researchers also, in showing that not only do children from low-income backgrounds have less access to print in their homes, they have less access to print in their neighborhoods. There aren't big fancy libraries typically in low-income neighborhoods compared to middle-income neighborhoods. And when they get to school, they get even less access to print because they're seen as needing direct instruction that focuses only on the foundational skills of reading. And after the National Reading Panel report, the Bush administration funded the Reading First initiative, which was very admirable in intent. It provided $6 billion over 6 years, so about $1 billion a year, with the express intention of enabling or supporting low-income children in acquiring reading skills. What did they do? They basically said the panels that decided who's going to get this money said that if you're not doing intensive phonics and preferably scripted phonics instruction, you're not going to get the money. They refused to give New York City funds initially because they had a phonics program called Month by Month Phonics, so it was focused on phonics, but it violated the ideological prejudices of the panel by encouraging kids to write, by encouraging classroom libraries. This was not scientifically based reading instruction according to the narrow perspective of reading first decision makers. And so what happened? Taxpayers spent $6 billion to find that this $6 billion were essentially flushed down the toilet. The Reading First evaluation showed that there was no impact on reading comprehension in either grades 1, 2, or 3. There was no impact on reading engagement. There was an impact on decoding skills in grade 1, but not after that. And so you had a lot of money that was wasted because of inadequate and essentially irresponsible interpretation of the research. So what was left out of this? In addition to teaching foundational skills, in addition to teaching phonics, making sure that kids have phonological awareness, all of those things are important. But also, when we look at why it is that kids from more affluent backgrounds are doing relatively well in terms of picking up reading skills compared to kids from low-income backgrounds, what we're looking at is a difference in literacy socialization. We're looking at a difference in print access. We're looking at a difference in terms of children's acquisition of concepts about print. And so what's missing in terms of reading instruction right now is putting together an emphasis on foundational skills and obviously making sure that kids can decode is really important. We know that. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. Phonics instruction is going to work much, much better when it's integrated into a context of a literacy-rich environment where they're listening to stories being read, they're dramatizing stories, they're having fun with stories, with what they're doing with print, they're talking about print, they're bringing books home to read with their parents come in as partners to this, where if parents don't have the money to buy books, then schools should be supplying those books for parents and enabling students to bring children home, these books home. Is this evidence-based? Of course it's evidence-based. There's a huge amount of research literature out there showing that one of the major predictors of reading comprehension is the extent to which students get actively engaged with literacy. They've got to have print access, and then we've got to create a motivating environment where they want to read. And that's what's been missing, and that's what's missing right now in terms of this whole reading debate. So I said initially that the issues are far more simple than they've been made to appear. What we need is a double focus on providing students access with the instruction that they need to break the code in terms of the relationship between the sounds of the language, the spoken language, and the written language. Nobody is disputing that that's important. But we also need to add the second part. We need to turn the coin around and look at what's on the other side. And what's on that other side is the importance of print access, literacy engagement, which can broadly be thought of as literacy socialization. And kids who have not experienced as much of that in their homes and in their neighborhoods prior to coming to school need this much more even than kids from middle-class backgrounds, because they've already got 4 years advantage in terms of this. And this is what has been totally left out of the equation by some of the people who are pushing intensive phonics as a panacea.
Thank you so much for that clarification. As a former first grade teacher, that was always a struggle, is how much do I spend teaching that direct instruction, the phonics, the letter sound correlation, but at the same time, I want to grow readers, right? I want kids who love books, who can't wait to get to the class library, or who want to take a book home and share it with their family. So that idea of a double focus, allowing educators to realize that there can be equal importance on both when it comes to creating a balanced literacy program and a classroom that is really looking at a goal of growing readers. So that's a really helpful analysis there. Now, I want to just shift a little bit to the consideration of English learners. What role does multilingualism play in that effective literacy?
Well, one of the key points about learning in general is that we learn in terms of what we already know. We bring our prior knowledge to the table. And unless the instruction connects up with our prior knowledge, we're going to be floundering for a bit. We don't know how to fit this into our mental cognitive psychologists called schemata, the kind of programs that we've got in our brains that help us to interpret and give meaning to what we're encountering or what we're learning. And so if we're looking at students who are coming from multilingual backgrounds, who speak another language at home, who have had different kinds of cultural experiences than maybe the experiences of children that curriculum developers had in mind when they were developing these programs, then we've got to say, okay, what did these children bring in terms of assets to the table that we can connect up with? So they've got different kinds of experiences because they've got different language knowledge when they're coming in. We need to, provide scaffolding instruction. If the instruction is totally in English, we need to make sure that students are given the support that they need to acquire English, to acquire spoken English, to acquire written English. All of those things are important. But we also need to tap into what linguists have called the funds of knowledge that children have in their communities. This is basically their experiences, their cultural experiences, their family knowledge. All of those things are really important too. So when we look at multilingual students, first of all, we need to address the fact that students' home languages are not an impediment to learning to read in English. They're an asset. All of the research shows that when children develop conceptual knowledge and literacy in their home language, that can transfer to English. And students who continue to develop, to speak their home language at home, who are multilingual throughout the elementary years because their parents keep on speaking that language to them, those students are doing better than children who have lost their home language. And unfortunately, that happens a lot because the message kids often get in school is that that language is not cool to speak in the school. What's been happening recently in a number of countries, in the United States and many countries in Europe and Canada, is that educators have begun to explore how we can tap into students' home languages in the classroom. The term translanguaging is one that has become common in the literature over the last 10 years, where teachers are seeing students' home language as an important asset in terms of their knowledge of how language works. If we're looking at a language like Spanish, for example, there are all kinds of cognate relationships to English, and particularly as students go through the grade levels, these have become increasingly important because English is a hybrid language. The everyday words, the everyday conversational language that we use when we're speaking one-on-one to each other in everyday contexts comes historically from Northern European languages like German, Dutch, Swedish, etc. And that's because the people who lived in England from about the 5th century to the 11th century were tribes who had come from Northern Europe. In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded what's now England, and he brought his language with him, and the Normans brought their language with them, and that was a language, a variety of Old French, that was derived from Latin and to a lesser extent Greek sources. And so the academic, and this language, the Latin-based language that the Normans brought in became the language of high prestige activities. It was the language of the nobles. It was the language of education. The only people who could get education were the essentially sons and daughters of nobles or rich people. And it was obviously the language of the church at that stage. And that distinction between the conversational language and the academic language in English is still with us today, where the words that we use in everyday contexts are high-frequency words that come predominantly from Northern European sources. But the academic words, the more difficult words that we use in formal contexts and that are heavily represented in printed text, come from Latin-based sources. So a child who speaks Spanish as a first language has a huge potential advantage in terms of becoming aware of how the words in his or her first language, everyday words that they might have, link in with less common words in English. If you take the word encounter in English, that's a synonym for meet. Meet comes from Anglo-Saxon sources, encounter comes from Latin. The word in Spanish is encontrar. And you can go on and on and on in terms of those connections. So a child who immigrates from Mexico, let's say at grade 6, and is faced with not only learning everyday English, but also reading material at that level, has a huge potential advantage, because a lot of the words in the content areas that she or he will encounter have cognate relationships to the first languages. And so when we look at the long term, a child who comes into school speaking another language obviously has an increased challenge in terms of learning English and becoming literacy in English in the early stages. But that's not because of their first language. That's because they need to learn the language. But as they go through the grade levels, there are potentially far greater benefits in terms of children's awareness of how language works. And if the language is a language like Spanish that has relationships to English, then there's a lot of transfer of vocabulary knowledge across languages. And after about grade 4, vocabulary becomes increasingly indistinguishable from reading comprehension at a psychometric level. If you took 2 different vocabulary measures and looked at the correlations between them, they would be pretty close to the correlation between a reading comprehension measure and a vocabulary measure. And same way, if you took 2 different reading comprehension measures, looked at the correlation between them, it's not going to be that much bigger than the correlation between a reading comprehension measure and a vocabulary measure. And this becomes more prominent as students go up the grade levels. So from a psychometric point of view, vocabulary is key. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of other things that we need to do in terms of developing reading comprehension, but vocabulary is a key element. And kids from multilingual backgrounds have a really important long-term benefit in terms, or advantage in terms of their growth in English literacy from that point of view.
Wow, you are, my brain is just on overload and trying to take all of that in. I mean, in my over 20 years of education, I think that, I've read and listened and attended lots of conferences around literacy and multilingual learners. But I think this idea of reading comprehension and vocabulary and them coming together in actual almost alignment when it comes to achievement levels. And then for me, I'm always thinking, so what does this look like in the classroom? How does this influence my decisions as an educator? And so that focus on, like you said, the cognates or the similarities between the home language and the language of instruction, and making sure that that's explicitly taught and not just valued and honored, but also used as a tool for achievement. I think that's just a really awesome point that's really resonating with me. So thank you for that response.
If I can just add one other aspect to this, if we ask ourselves, where do children learn vocabulary? How do they learn vocabulary? We find academic language in 2 places, okay? We find it in classrooms and we find it in printed text. So obviously there'll be direct instruction in classrooms where teachers will explain the meaning of words, etc. But the research is really clear that the more children are reading, the more they're getting access to low frequency vocabulary. And the children who are reading extensively are the ones who are developing strong reading comprehension skills. And so that's why the programs that, from my reading of the research, work best in terms of long-term development of English literacy are programs that integrate the teaching of foundational skills, integrate phonics and other aspects of decoding skills into a rich literacy environment where, for example, children might be learning or reading about scientific topics like animals, climate, and other things in grade-appropriate books that they would be introduced to in kindergarten. The teacher would do a lot of read-alouds with this, but they're coming across the vocabulary that they need and developing decoding skills as they're reading this material. There's certainly a place, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any standalone phonics instruction or whole class phonics instruction, but that should be probably limited to maybe 10, 15 minutes a day. And the rest of the focus should be on integrating this knowledge with what children are reading. And then children should have the opportunity to bring books home, to read with their parents, because when you're doing that, you're doubling up the instructional time. If parents can get involved in it. And now some parents may not speak English. Some parents may not be highly literate because they haven't had the opportunity to go to school for any length of time. In that particular case, you can have children reading to their parents. And again, there's a body of research out there that shows that this can be a very powerful strategy. So immersion of children into an engaging literacy environment where they're not only learning how to decode, but they're talking about books. They're doing additional research. They're talking to their parents about what they're reading. They want their parents to read this book about whales or about dinosaurs or whatever it is. And so you develop a community of literacy within the classroom that extends into children's homes also. And parents don't necessarily know how to do this. And that's why you need to have a strong school community set of linkages so that parents realize that they do have a role as partners in helping children learn how to read. And this can happen in children's home language as much as in English. So one of the messages that teachers need to convey very clearly to parents is that they should continue to speak their home language. If they can get access to books in their home language, they should read those books because that will transfer, that will develop children's awareness of language. They compare and contrast how English does things with how they're done in their home language. And this is important in terms of, much broader aspects of children's lives than just literacy. If we want children to be able to talk to their grandparents, that probably is going to have to happen in the home language because grandparents who may have come to this country as adults probably are not going to speak a lot of English. And so if we want that, if we see that intergenerational transmission and communication as something valuable in children's development of a personal identity, then we need to do what we can within the classroom from the very earliest stages to support children in learning English, but also maintaining their home language. And this involves giving explicit messages to children about the value of multiple languages. And it's not that difficult to do, but we've seen that as kind of secondary importance. It's not a case of which is more important. It's a case of looking at the whole environment for literacy. And if we believe in children's prior knowledge meaning something, if we believe in tapping into the funds of knowledge that come from their community, then we can't basically tell children, leave your home language at the schoolhouse door. It doesn't belong here. We may not give that message explicitly, but if children and parents walk through the school and they never see anything on the walls, in the corridors or in the classrooms in a language other than English, then the message is very clear about the fact that school is an English-only zone. So teachers need to be proactive in giving this message to children and to their parents that their children have an amazing advantage in terms of their home languages. And if they want their children to become multilingual, parents have to work at it. They've got to use that language. And teachers have to work on taking every opportunity to highlight the fact that these languages are not just irrelevant, they provide all kinds of opportunities for children throughout their schooling, but also in their lives after school and beyond school.
Jem, I feel like I'm just getting like this private tutoring right now, and I'm so honored. And I'm just gonna bring up, because again, I have that high school background. When you're talking about the history of language, right, and the Norman the Conqueror, it reminded me so much of Chaucer and like the Canterbury Tales and the way that language plays into each of the characters. And I just saw this big like connection that I'm like, oh, I can't wait to go back and talk to my students about it. What an amazingly rich conversation we've had today. Please join us next time in part 2 of our interview with Dr. Cummins, during which we'll hear about the good and the bad of educational policy focusing on literacy. And Dr. Cummins is going to tell us even more about literacy saturation. So for more information and to get access to all the resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast.